on the Women's Super League, I think you made a really good point the weekend, and I think there's a lot to unpack there when you look at the scorelines, which are pretty nightmarish.
I mean, there's an interesting thing, isn't there? Because I think we, on this programme, when they announced for the Zealand Warrington were going to be promoted, it'll be a couple of years ago now, we were a bit unsure about it. Every player we've spoken to has been in favour of it. So who are we to say, go against what they think? But I think this weekend has almost shown what we said to an extent. It's not that we're taking 1 week and saying that's what's going to happen for the rest of the season.
But it's the way that the fixtures fell as well. I think when you looked
at we said that as well.
You could see teams that that are going to be at the top of the league playing teams that are going to be at the bottom of the league. I think the other thing is we get too hung up about scores. If you equate 10 points in rugby league to a goal in football, which I think is a fair comparison, then you're talking about 6-0, 7-0, 8-0. Well, I seem to remember, was it Southampton got beat 9-0 in the Premiership this year, and they were in the semi-final of the FA Cup, and Arsenal, was it Liverpool, who were the defending champions, got beaten by 7 at Aston Villa? I wouldn't worry about it. We know that there is a disparity between the haves and have-nots, and that a couple of the teams were new to the game. To put Bradford up against St Helens was always going to be the most difficult of asks when you look at who St Helens have recruited and where Bradford are at the moment in the women's game. I just think the coverage it got, the depth and the breadth before a ball was kicked in so many different media outlets, from national newspapers to social media sites, the number of people who were interviewed across the different clubs who all came across brilliantly well. They've got some really great, vibrant personalities. The fact that Twitch took a game and what were the figures today? 30,000 people were watching it, 300,000 worldwide. I don't know how you measure that, but again, they seem like really good numbers for a game that wasn't close. You look at Sky are now doing a highlights package every week from that Twitch game. We're building up to a women's international. We're building up to grand finals that are being shown live, Challenge Cup finals that are being shown live, and a World Cup that, again, let's be honest, Australia and New Zealand, we already know are going to dominate it because they're fully professional and at a different standard. That isn't going to stop.
They're not fully professional.
Well,
I don't mean to interrupt you there, but I disagree with a lot of what you said there, because I think you can account 1 or 2 blowouts, but when you get an 86-0, a 52-8, a 68-16, and a 40-6, you've effectively got 2 competitions. You've got,
but we know that.
Yeah, but why would you bring in 2 very weak teams to an already competition that's lopsided? I mean, it's madness. I understand they want to grow women's rugby league. They want more opportunities. And I'm not just saying because this is what the NRL does, it's better. But in the NRL, they have 4 teams. So you hothouse the talent, the very best, play against the very best. It's like an origin every week. It's a short competition. They are paid. They're not full-time, but I think they're semi-pro. You'd probably say they're paid partly. But it makes them better because there are no blowouts. They're competing against the best. Here, and that flows into the Australian and New Zealand national teams. Hence, they are so good. We've got a World Cup this year. If England get absolutely flogged in the Women's World Cup, what is that going to do? It's just going to back for the game.
Now, what it'll do is the opening game when England play Brazil, which again, your argument would say Brazil shouldn't be in it because it's like
Fiji actually qualified and Brazil got it's a joke. But anyway, we won't go into that.
I think there is going to be not far short of 15 to 20,000 people there, and that justifies it.
Yes, Phil, but when the Silver Ferns, beat England by 40 points, or when the Gillaroos beat them by 50 points, and I think it was Danica Prim on this program speaking as someone who's played for England in World Cups, who said in 2013 the gap wasn't much. In 2017 the gap was quite a lot. I'm pretty sure the gap's only gotten worse because they're taking leaps and bounds and they're playing, they're restricting to make the quality better. While over here, we're just flooding in and making the quality a lot worse. And I just think it's really the wrong approach. And I've spoken to people in the women's game who agree with me. No one sort of publicly come out and said it, but I just think it's completely the wrong approach. I think, particularly for a new sport, you need to increase the intensity. And maybe you only have 4 clubs, and maybe you only have Castleford, Leeds, and Helens and Wigan, and then you have a second division. So you've got those opportunities, but it would improve the national team, which if the national team got some success in the World Cup, or they beat Australia and New Zealand in a few tests, as opposed to being beaten by PNG in PNG and being 4th rate, if not 3rd rate, I'm sure that would be a better overall for the women's game, because I think it's gonna, it could be I don't want to say a disaster, but it could be a disaster in the World Cup.
No, I don't think it's anything other than. I agree that in principle we are running a little bit before we can walk, but I do think this is about participation and exposure. And the press release today saying that there's going to be a competition in the south of England and Wales for women is a huge step forward. I think the more people that you can get into the reservoir, the greater the bigger the pool of talent, the better the fish will be that come out of it. So I just think you look at women's soccer. I don't follow it, but I can see that there are some results that are like 7-0, 8-0, 10-0. Wasn't there an Australian goalkeeper who plays for one of the English teams that ended up playing outfield this week because the team so easily? But when we got to the World Cup, the Women's World Cup, it would have been great if England had won, but it was clearly evident that teams like America were so much better than them. But they got to the semi-final, they got the nation behind them, they got more girls playing soccer, they got pundits then in the media. Yeah, I think there is no right or wrong way of doing it. I just think that we shouldn't look at one week's results where we knew there were going to be wide margins and say that doesn't justify what we're doing. To me, and I think I tweeted it over the weekend, this is the area of the sport more than any other at the moment that can drag it into the 21st century and make it commercial and viable.
I don't see that though.
I agree with you. The potential is massive, and that's why it's so important we get it right. And that's why I think this approach is wrong, because it mirrors the Super League, Championship, League One approach, where you've got too many places and not enough good players to go around to. So you've got a watering down of the quality as opposed to a hothouse, which actually it makes the intensity greater and produces better players from that environment. You talk about, and excuse the irony, but the Women's Super League is what the women's football competition is called in England. And the reason why that's gone strength to strength, not only because it's got Premier League clubs backing it, but they've now got arguably the best players outside of America in the world. So Chelsea have got England internationals, they've got Germany, they've got Australian internationals, and it is really high quality stuff. Yes, you still get a couple of clubs, I think Bristol City and probably West Ham are down the boat, but they've all got internationals from around the world, much like the Premier League. And that's why that competition is much better than it was perhaps 2 or 3, 4 years ago. You are always going to get blowouts. And, Leeds v Cass is going to be a great game. Wigan v Leeds, St Helens v Cass, etc. But 86-0, I don't think that helps anyone. I mean, I'm sorry, Rich, I'll just say this last time. I've played football / soccer a long time, and I can remember losing 10-0, 11-0. It didn't do me any good, and that was in a church competition. So, yeah.
When I saw the handicaps the bookmakers have put out for Saints versus Bradford, I thought 24 points is very low, but I didn't expect Saints to win by that many. But
that was only for the first 10 minutes.
I know. But as we said weeks ago, the first round of fixtures, in terms of, they were terrible. They were not what you should launch the season with. And you should have had Leeds versus Cass or Wigan versus Saints or whatever, because I'm not sure what you get from some of those games at the weekend. Warrington seem to be the darlings of the competition, of the promoted sides, because they're Warrington. But just because they've got the same name as the men's team doesn't mean that they're the same level in terms of quality. I mean, they're on again this week against Huddersfield in the Challenge Cup, and no one's seen Huddersfield, so we don't have a clue what that's going to be like.
Bradford used to be really successful, Rich. What's happened to them?
A lot of their players signed for Leeds, like D Prim would be one of them.
Who?
Bloody Leeds.
She's persona non grata now. She's on Radio Leeds. We don't talk about her. And everywhere else. And of course, Amy Hardcastle went to St Helens, and she was on 5 Live on Sunday morning. And people say to you, why do you talk so much about the women's game? Why do you spend this much time talking about League One or the Championship where more people watch? Because you don't get it. Because there's no one from Championship Club or League One Club going on 5 Live and talking about Rugby League. Well,
unless it's Gavin Henson, where again you're talking about a star name. I think we shouldn't focus on the results. I think that the fixtures look to me like they've been geared up to have those intense games that you were talking about towards the end of the regular season and leading into the playoffs. And the idea of that is that those who will be playing in the England World Cup squad will get the intense games when they need them leading into the World Cup. So I think a lot of thought has gone into it. But I think we are going for it's very much about we're a sport that is reliant on external funding. And one of our chief funders at the moment is Sport England. And one of the things they measure the sport on are participation numbers. And I think a conscious decision has been made, particularly dripping down into the community level, to say the more women we can have playing, the more exposure we can give the women's game, the more likelihood there is for more women and girls to play. Therefore, we can get more Sport England funding. So I can see why they've got. I agree with you. And we said it right at the very beginning that I honestly thought there should have been 2 divisions this year. The haves and the have-nots, and then the haves contain all the players that are going to end up at the World Cup, and they are properly prepared for when that World Cup comes along. But we've got 1 division. I think there's a debate to be had going right back to the very beginning of this programme about what does a modern sporting model look like and what can we learn from what's happening in football at the moment. How many teams do we want in Super League if we want to get the kind of quality that will ever beat Australia again? Well, and it isn't 12 and it isn't 14.
Well, Phil, it's the state of origin argument, isn't it? It's that the NRL is intensity, and then the state of origin is a higher intensity, and then the Australians from that. So when they come against New Zealand and England, they have it's an unfair advantage, an additional advantage. It's a similar thing in the women's game, really, and I think that's why they're going. They got 15,000 people. What was it? Not last year, before at a state of origin game at North Sydney, because the women's game there is such a high standard because it is just the best, the very best against the very best. There's no 86-0s. There's no, but I could be wrong, and I'll probably be proven wrong in the World Cup. So
the other thing I would ask, because I'm not au fait with it, is what is the level of women's rugby league like underneath those 4 teams that is feeding them? So I know there's a New South Wales competition, there's a Queensland competition. Charlotte Booth, I think, is playing for one of the Queensland teams. So clearly there is women's rugby league. What kind of standard is that feeds into it?
Because I'm in South Yorkshire, I couldn't comment particularly, but you are right. Yeah, I think there's a Sydney competition, a Brisbane competition. Much like there is in the men's game, Queensland Cup, or Brisbane, New South Wales Cup, which feeds into that. But you then you can cherry pick. I think it's the Roosters, isn't it? And maybe South Sydney. They can pick the best players from that competition to play in the NRLW, as the Broncos can, and the New Zealand Warriors. So effectively, the New Zealand Warriors are a Silver Ferns New Zealand national team, which is great for them. I mean, could you imagine an England team, de facto England team, playing in the Women's Super League?
Yeah, they're called St Helens, John.
Yeah, I thought they were called Leeds. But yeah, look, it will be interesting. I mean, I think the proof will be in the pudding. I just think there's more chance of England catching up in the women's game quickly than in the men's game, because it's such at an early point in terms of its origin, its birth. But I think the watering down from this point is in my opinion, and as I said, it's only my opinion, is the wrong strategy. But you are right, Phil, that there's got to be a push to get media coverage, visibility, participation up as well. And massive push for women's sport across all sports, netball, football, basketball, etc. So, rugby league definitely needs to be, women's rugby union, it needs to be right a part of that.